There are several Indigenous nations that I would like to mention. We'd like to honor and respect the sovereignty of both First Nations in our area, the Haudenosaunee peoples of Six Nations of the Grand River, and the Anishinaabe peoples of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Niawe and Miigwech to these nations who share their lands with us. We'd also like to acknowledge the neutral peoples and their ancestors and the Indigenous paleo hunters that we have archaeological evidence for at Rare dating back 1,200 and 10,500 years. Lastly, we'd like to acknowledge those Indigenous peoples who currently live, work, and learn in the urban landscape around us, such as other self-identified and status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Of course, you may be participating from somewhere else today, and so I really encourage you to learn more about the land that you are living and learning on. And one resource I can point you to is an app called Whose Land, which is available to download for free and is a great starting point for you if you're looking to learn more about the territory on which you reside or work. So I'm excited to get started today, and I just have a few quick housekeeping things before we can dive right in. So first of all, we'll hold questions until the end of today, but at any time you can feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and post questions, and so we'll receive them there and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the talk today. And if you have any comments you want to share along the way, if you want to be sharing with us how you're feeling and tasting and smelling during the apple tasting, we're really happy to receive those comments in the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. We're going to spend about the first hour or so today hearing from all our panelists and tasting our apples, and then we'll have time for a conversation and some questions at the end. And I'd really like to take a second to thank Silver Creek Nursery, who provided all of our panelists today with apples for apple tasting. They sell a wide variety of heritage apples there, as well as other fruit trees, and they normally do an apple tasting in October, but of course with COVID that wasn't able to happen this year. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to try all these tasty apples together with all of you. So check them out, Silver Creek Nursery. And thanks also to the Cambridge North Dumfries Community Foundation, who provided a community grant that has helped run our whole Arts and Science Showcase. So today was day one. This is the final event of a long day of great content to share. So stay tuned and check out day 2 and day 3 tomorrow and follow along learning about all the great community and science and art projects that are happening at Rare. Okay, so on to the panelists then. It's my pleasure to introduce to you all the faces that you're seeing today. There's some short bios being shared in the chat, so definitely read those and learn a little bit more about all these exceptional guests. But really briefly, we have Anna Bowen from Musagetes, who's going to be facilitating our Q&A later this evening. We also have Dr. Brian Husband and Paul Kron from the University of Guelph, who are the leads of our longest running research project at Rare, which is around crabapples. So really excited to hear more about that. Dr. Karen Houle is also here with us, a philosophy prof from the University of Guelph and also a poet and author of this amazing book, yes, right here, The Grand River Watershed, A Folk Ecology. So looking forward to hearing more from you, Karen. And finally, kicking us off this evening, I'm pleased to introduce Diane Borsato, an award-winning artist and educator from the University of Guelph, who's going to be speaking with us today about her recent apple-related exhibition and really guiding us through this virtual tasting experience. So I will pass it over to you, Diane, to start us off.
Hi, everybody. Am I visible now? Hopefully. Okay. It's really nice to see you all, sort of, and I'm really very honored and happy to be here. Thanks so much, Jenna, and also to Mana and everyone at Rare, and to Anna for moderating. It's really nice to be among other nature enthusiasts, apple enthusiasts especially, and apple experts. So I'm going to share my screen here and show briefly about a project that I've made. Oops. Okay. Okay. So this is from a project that I just recently made last year at this time, actually. I started to become really interested in apples, and I began learning about grafting and working on a tree in the backyard of my house in Toronto. And, I'm sort of an amateur naturalist. I have a lot of nature hobbies. I keep bees and I collect mushrooms, and I really do love objects I can have in my hand, something like an apple, so accessible, so relatable, very, wonderful to eat an apple, easy to find. And I began to realize that there were so many exciting varietals and a huge diversity among apple varietals. And so, it took a couple of years for me to learn a little more about how apple trees grow, how you make a distinctive varietal. And I decided to propose a small orchard of unusual apple varietals as public art. And so this is from a poster that I made in progress while I was creating this small orchard in Mississauga. The poster describes the 12 varietals that I did plant at the Small Arms Inspection Building. It's at the corner of Dixie and Lakeshore in Mississauga. It was being operated as an art gallery and cultural center at the time last year. And it took a few years to realize this because, of course, proposing this living, sprawling, slow-growing bunch of trees as a public sculpture, did take some time and some convincing for municipal officials. But eventually I was permitted to do this and was able to kind of conquer all the logistical obstacles and find a way to plant these trees and get the support that was needed to make sure that they thrive. And so, I really did begin my enthusiasm with apples thinking about different varietals. And just as an example, I selected 12 varietals after a couple of years of tasting apples anywhere I could go. And the most amazing place I found was an orchard near Owen Sound operated by Bill O'Keefe. And it's called O'Keefe Grange. And I don't know if my other panelists know about Bill, but he's kind of like a curator of an apple museum. He has 500 or 600 different apple varietals. He has apples from all over the world. He talked about, smuggling sticks in envelopes, relationships with universities around the planet. And he is just so enthusiastic. He'll call me every so often and just want to talk to me about apples for a couple of hours. He's a kind of collector of apple varietals and very knowledgeable about the history. And so through his orchard and his collection, I was able to experience and learn about a lot of apple varietals. And I selected 12 that would give a diverse range in the orchard. And so just as an example, there's one apple called Pedro, which is very, very rare. Bill is quite sure that he has the only tree left in North America. So as of the time of making the poster, nobody probably alive had ever tasted a Pedro, an Ontario apple from the late 1800s. And so I was able to plant one Pedro in the Mississauga orchard. And last year was able to taste the first 2 Pedros that Bill had grown in his orchard, which was pretty exciting. So I chose some very old historic Ontario apples. I also chose curious apples with exciting flavors, surprising apples like the pineapple renette. These are cute little golden suns of apples that taste like pineapple. They really do. I planted some apples that I just knew were hardy for diseases and would survive, like William's Pride. I wanted to have a range of colors of apples. There's like a shiny red Sleeping Beauty, a fairly, cheerful, round, like quintessential apple. Some crab apples. There's a Hughes crab, which is quite a sweet, wonderful little crab apple that is supposed to be great for making a lot of juice and cider that is reminiscent of cinnamon and champagne. And some of my favorite apples that I tasted and was able to include in the orchard, Candil Sinap. this exquisitely beautiful apple. It's very oblong. It's almost like an elongated egg, and it has this very thin skin and has been compared to porcelain. It's translucent and blushing, very beautiful apple from Turkey. The Tolman Sweet, which I found evidence of Tolman Sweet growing in orchards in Mississauga over the last 100, 200 years. And this is a delicious apple. And my favorite description of apple flavors that I've ever read was from Rowan Jacobson, who describes a Tolman Sweet as tasting like elements of Calvados, chanterelle ice cream, and a pear that fantasizes about being a pumpkin. Just like incredible. Another of my favorite apples is the pink pearl. I loved to discover that there were apples with red flesh and pink flesh. There was an apple in O'Keefe Grange that was, he told me, red as a beet. And of course I thought he might be exaggerating. And when you cut it open, it's like a raw steak. It was this dark red apple all through and through. It tasted awful to me. So instead I selected as a red fleshed variety, a pink pearl, which is really one of the most beautiful apples I've ever seen. It has this very thin flesh that's kind of a creamy pink color, and you can see through it to the glowing red insides. I read accounts by Thoreau of loving apples, and he talks about apples with a beautiful blush, fairy food, too beautiful to eat, and it made me think of the pink pearl. Another of the apples that I included is an apple discussed in a recent book by Helen Humphreys called Ghost Orchard, which I recommend if you're an apple lover. And in it, she chases this apple, considered to be one of the most delicious tasting apples in the world, tastes somewhat like pears, very delicate, very beautiful apple, yellow. And in her quest to sort of find a tree or taste another white winter pearmain, she researches the remains of indigenous orchards, which had been widespread around North America and had been exclusively destroyed by settlers. And so there are very, very few apples that had been kept by indigenous peoples left anymore. The vast majority are extinct and no longer exist. However, since discussing this project quite a bit with Bill O'Keefe, he's become really excited and curious about finding some of these last apple varietals that had been developed in indigenous orchards. And so since last year, I believe he has 2 or 3 more varietals, if anyone's curious about it, that had been developed in indigenous orchards. And so I dreamed of this orchard and was able to plant, it's very small, it's only 12 trees, but was able to use this corner of public space outside the Small Arms Inspection Building. And I should mention that the Small Arms Building, if you've never been there, was formerly a bomb factory. It was used during the Second World War, and women moved and lived there, women from across Canada, to make small weapons and bombs. And the site is apparently quite contaminated. It's been a big project restoring this building and cleaning up the site. And there's something sort of poignant for me about growing this fruit and creating this kind of restorative project, a gift to a local community around the orchard in what used to be a place where they made bombs. So this is myself and my son and some staff from the city planting the apple trees. And so to inaugurate the orchard last year, and it's takes my breath away to look at these pictures this year, because this was precisely a year ago. I invited Bill O'Keefe, and I also obtained some apples from Vinland, from the University of Guelph Research Station in Niagara, and was able to accumulate enough apples, at least 40 varieties, like with enchanting names like Snow and Opalescence and Star Song and Pink Princess, Maiden Blush, Seek No Further, Rambo, and Hornburger Pancake, things like that. And we were able to offer to the public in Mississauga a chance to taste all these apples. Many of us have only ever tasted maybe 7 or 8 kinds that are typically available in the supermarket. And so this was kind of an amazing joy, just to have this range of apples and to taste in some ways history, and to taste these cultural, because apples are really made by people in various ways. And so to taste this culture from around the world and from across time. I should mention too that at the event, Bill O'Keefe also spoke about his orchard and about apple varietals. And through the course of my research developing this project, I also met the wonderful Susan Poisner, who has the only urban orchard that I know about in Toronto. And she has a project called Orchard People, where she teaches people fruit tree care, organic fruit tree care. And we also invited Newcomer Kitchen, which is an amazing group of Syrian women, Syrian newcomer women who cook, and they made Syrian apple cake for everyone at this event as well. And so I visited the orchard 2 weeks ago, and my trees are twice the size. This is my son who will grow with these trees. And I managed, the orchard would have died, I would guesstimate, about 5 times since the pandemic started. There were a lot of complications, getting the city to commit to taking care of these trees when everything else was so difficult, of course, in the world. And so I managed to keep the trees watered and safe and alive and protected from deer, and found a couple of really committed volunteers and professional arborists to help take care of these trees in the long term. The city of Mississauga has officially accepted the orchard as part of their public art collection. And so they have actually committed to taking care of the orchard in perpetuity. So part of the agreement is that if any of these trees, submit to blight or mildew or mice or old age, that they actually have to replant new varietals, and I have specific requests and recommendations for what they would plant. So as far as everyone is committed, this orchard has to be cared for in perpetuity. And for me, that's a really exciting thing. So without further ado, I would love to taste some apples with some of the other panelists. That's a pink pearl sliced open from the apple tasting last year. And so maybe if I invite a couple of you, we can have a look at some of the apples that we were given from Silver Creek Nursery, like maybe Jenna and Anna, if you guys will appear somehow. I would love to look at some apples that you have and we can taste them together. Hi. I have some apples too, and I just wanted to invite you guys to look at your apple. Maybe you could show your apples. Maybe everyone at home has an apple. And before we taste it, I thought it would be wonderful just to look at our apples and see if you might describe for everyone at home the shape of your apple and the size of your apple, and some things you might notice about the color and the markings on the skin. So I can start by saying, if you can see this, I think I have, I just got this from the supermarket. I think it's a ginger gold. And what I thought was curious about it is that it has this, these kind of feet. It has ribs that are very prominent, and it has these kinds of bumpy feet at the bottom, sometimes called a sheep nose, which I think is a great term. And it's also a lopsided apple, not exactly round, not exactly oblong, and is this wonderful sort of creamy yellow green, quite bright. What does your apple look like, Anna?
So my apple is this is a Dolgo crab, and it's probably just 2 inches big. Like a very big grape.
Yeah, I have one too.
Has a little nose on the end, and it's super shiny and sort of reddish with a bit of orange, cherry, almost cherry colored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like poppy. Do you want to actually that's great. And maybe Jenna can describe your apple and we'll compare our apples.
Yeah. Do you think you could stop sharing your screen quickly,
yes.
just so we could be full?
Thank you. Thank you. That is much better.
Yes. Yeah, my apple is pretty sort of medium to small size, kind of glossy, smooth skin. But what I really like about it is just like really rich, deep red, and then some lighter red. And you can even see some flecks of like green and yellow in it. So really kind of beautiful and kind of ombre, changes colors across it.
And what is your apple?
Mine is called a Nova Mac. So it's really closely related to the Macintosh. And I learned that it's called Nova Mac because it's from Nova Scotia. And a lot of apples, I guess, have the word Nova in them because they come from Nova Scotia.
Wow, from my screen, it almost looks like brown, like a sort of polished wood, like a dark, dark brown. Wonderful. So let's slice open our apples and let's compare how they look inside. And we can just start to describe the texture maybe when we take a bite of it, of the skin and of the flesh. So I'm going to cut this ginger gold, and everyone at home can taste their apples too. Already when I'm cutting this, it's quite, it's not very crunchy. It's quite a smooth, it's like cutting a golden delicious kind of. Anna, what's the texture of your apple and how does it look inside?
It's very firm and a bit crunchy and very tart.
Very tart, eh? Is there any sweetness at all?
Yeah, there's some sweetness for sure. It's not as tart as a crab apple I might grab off the, a tree passing by. This is pretty special.
And so it's crunchy. Is the skin like tough and leathery, or you just get right through it?
No, I think it's pretty thin. I think you can probably see it's just.
Mm-hmm. And it's bright white inside.
Yeah.
And, And Jenna, how's your apple inside?
Yeah, mine is really white flesh on the inside. Really smells and sort of tastes like a Macintosh. The skin is a little bit thick, like you crunch right through it. And then the inside is really juicy, really sweet with just that kind of a tangy appley flavor at the end.
Does it remind you of a Macintosh?
Yes, it does.
Mm-hmm. I think my ginger gold is probably past its prime, and so it has that kind of mealy, old golden delicious sort of like melting mealy sort of flesh. I know that when these are fresh, which is like for a week, they're really delicious and juicy. But that's interesting. Thank you guys for sharing your apple. I'm gonna move on now to Karen, and we'll check out a green sleeves. Hi, Karen. And we can't hear you, Karen, so you'll have to unmute. Hi.
Hi.
It's great to see you. So which apples do you have?
I've got a green sleeves.
Yeah, those are wonderful apples. And that's what they look like inside. What do they look like outside? How big are they? How big is the green sleeves and what?
Size of my fist. So very average sized female fist, like that. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And greeny yellow skin. And a couple little evidence of worm life.
And it seems kind of a squat apple. It's not a tall apple.
Yeah, it's a bit squat.
Yeah, I've tasted them before, and maybe the samples that I had were small, but I remember they were like cute little squat green apples.
Cute little squat green apples.
Like smaller than a Granny Smith, but a similar kind of like bright green.
Yeah, very bright green, but its flavor it's mild. It seems, there's like a kind of vinegary note to it.
Oh.
I don't mean to sound like an apple snob. I just tasted vinegar all of a sudden. But
you mean very tart?
There's some tartness, which is good, because its flesh is not hard like a new Mac.
Mm-hmm.
It's ever so slightly mealy.
Yeah,
but I think it would be great.
Crunchy.
It's not super crunchy, but it would be great for applesauce or pie, or one of those Syrian apple cakes that now I want to try.
Yeah. One thing I learned when I tasted a lot of apples was like the chances that you have any of those apples in their prime is not that high because, you know, the commercial apples that we buy in the supermarket are engineered to be super long lasting. And so a lot of these apples that are not popularly, you know, grown commercially, it's because they might only be perfect for a week, you know, or, you know, they brown and become awful, you know, pretty quickly. And so it is sort of a treat to have one of these apples in their perfect moment. And you never know, it could be a little too far. Perhaps the ones I tasted were a little underripe because I remember them being like even more tart than a Granny Smith, sort of like high power Granny Smith, but they're adorable apples. Thanks for showing them.
Yeah, thanks. The skin is thinner than Granny Smith, so I'm quite fond of this. I'll keep eating the green sleeves. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I almost forgot to eat my Cox's orange pippin. I was starting to save it, but I'm going to taste this apple too. I have two apples that I could show the crowd. This is a golden russet, and this is a Cox's orange pippin. And these are nice examples of apples with like russeting on the skin. I think some people might be put off by the appearance of russety apples. They have almost a brownish crust or a scale all over the skin. But once you taste a delicious golden russet, and these are fairly available, you know, in vegetable markets at this time of year for a short time, they're delicious, fragrant, sweet apples, and sort of endearing in their, you know, homeliness in a way. Maybe I'll invite now Paul and Brian to come on, and they can talk about their apples while I bite into this very precious one Cox's orange pippin, which Paul was generous enough to sacrifice and send to me in Toronto, which I'm really excited about because I tasted this for the first time last year. A very popular English apple, like anyone from England will tell you it's their favorite apple and they'll swoon a little at the thought. I've learned since that it's very hard to grow these apples in Ontario. They're extremely vulnerable to apple diseases, and so commercially they're just not viable. But I understand they have a lot of grandchildren and cousins, and and people are trying to get the sort of tropical, marvelous candy-like sweetness of a Cox's orange pippin. You know, have been trying to reproduce that in an apple that might survive more. But I know that Brian is going to talk about some feral apples, and Paul is going to talk about wealthy. Brian, do you want to go first and talk about your apples?
Yeah, so I'm putting myself on the line for everyone by trying an unknown apple. This is a wild domestic apple. So it's a domestic apple that's now growing outside of cultivation. And you can see it's quite small. Here's sort of a typical orchard apple. And this is just one that I plucked off a tree on the weekend, and it's quite small. It's sort of flat topped. It's got a real beautiful golden color to it with red streaking. I don't know if you can see that very well.
Yeah, beautiful.
So yeah, and actually, unlike the green sleeves, it actually, and to my surprise, seems to be free of worms. So that's a good sign to start with. But it's sort of a creamy interior to it. What do Paul? What's yours look like?
Okay, so this is a wealthy. The reason I wanted to do this apple is that I grew it myself from a tree I got from Silver Creek Nursery. And I'd like to actually tell you the story behind the wealthy. It was developed in the 1860s by a grower in Minnesota who nearly went bankrupt trying to develop apple varieties. With his last $8, he bought a few more trees. He crossed one with a crabapple of some kind, and he got the wealthy. And there's a story that the reason it's called wealthy is because he said, finally, now I'll be wealthy. But that story is probably not true. He probably named it after his wife, whose name was Wealthy Hulle. So anyway, it's got a lot of red on it. It's got some green. Unfortunately, I kept it too long and it started to go bad, but I'm going to try to taste it anyway.
It's amazing, you know, I learned when I was, I love the names of apples and the stories behind them. And I learned a lot of apples are named after the orchardists' wives. There should be a collection, an orchard just of apples named after orchardists' wives. I like to think that Pedro might be a love of an orchardist too, because there's no explanation I could find for the origin of that name for this old Ontario apple. Would you like to taste it for us?
I'm tasting mine.
And so what is
Yes,
the feral apple like?
Got quite a firm skin and a soft, fairly bland, with an aftertaste of socks.
So
dirty
usually
socks.
when you grab a feral apple, you sort of brace yourself for that astringency, right? That's like biting into a unripe lemon or something. But this is more stinky socks and bland. Another of my favorite descriptions of an apple.
It's actually not too bad. I expected it to be
worse. I think probably a lot of the people watching, eat feral apples and try and find a good one. My favorite description of a terrible apple was, it's like sinking your teeth into an old baked potato. And Paul, how's your apple?
Well,
yeah, that pretty much describes it.
Well, it hasn't totally gone bad, so that's good. It's still crispy. When I earlier, like a few weeks ago, had one off the tree, it was definitely had some sweetness, but this is actually slightly tart, and I think it's getting a bit of a vinegary flavor to it.
Oh,
so
like
maybe it's
fermenting?
past its prime.
And around what year was that apple developed?
1860.
Right. Another thing I noticed, tasting the very, very old apples, Bill O'Keefe has apples that have been propagated since the Roman Empire. Like, he has super old apples. And then compared to the the last 30, 40 years, is the older apples were much softer. People liked a softer apple. Like, now we like a cracking honey crisp, full of juice, that bursts in your mouth. And older palates preferred softer apples and more tart apples. We like apples like soda pop sweet now compared to historic apples. Yeah, and apple snobs will shake their heads just like that. And brag about how we like tart apples, I'm sure. Someone is just saying Gala. Gala is so sweet. That's a good example of an apple for, contemporary palates and that lasts forever, etc., for better or worse. Yeah. Are there any other apples that anyone on the panel left wants to talk about or taste? I am sort of nibbling on my my Cox's Orange Pippin. I think I'm gonna savor it, but it's a curious apple with a bit of like a faint bit of russeting on it. And it is almost a shade of orange. I'm not sure if you can tell on your own screens. And at first I wasn't sure if that was why it was called Orange Pippin. But then when you taste it, you do notice almost a orangey, pineapple-y, citrusy kind of note in there. And it is a very tart apple that is also sweet. It's in a kind of good balance. It's not extremely crunchy, but it is certainly got more tooth than like a Macintosh or something like that. So wonderful apple. Again, so grateful to have one this year. Do you have any other apples you want to taste, Paul or Brian? No, that's great. Okay. Well, I hope at home everyone is
good.
Examining and enjoying their apples. It is a certain pleasure to like slice pieces of your apple and kind of really mindfully have a piece. So I hope everyone can enjoy that a little more, a way to feel something at least all together. So I will pass it on to Brian and Paul to talk about your projects and research now.
All right. So I will get the
Thanks.
presentation. I will get the presentation.
Thanks, Diane.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. I just have to get that feral apple out of my teeth now. So Paul and I we're going to give a bit of a tag team synopsis of some of the research that we've been doing over the last number of years. Like Diane, I think it's safe to say that Paul and I are attracted to the science of apples, but for some similar reasons, the diversity, the variability that's out there, and trying to understand the sources of some of that variation. So our research has been going, Paul informed me scarily, there was over 17 years now at Rare. And that's been led by Paul and me, and with the help of a number of graduate and undergraduate student assistants. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of a summary of some of the things that have emerged from that work. And I think it's safe to say that the research that we've done so far is really, it can be described as a tale of two different apple species, the sweet crabapple and the domestic apple. So maybe we'll just give you a little bit of a quick rundown on those two characters before we talk about some of the science. Anytime, Paul. Great. So this is the sweet crabapple. It's known as, in the scientific world, as Malus coronaria, Malus being the apple genus. And it's not very widely known by most people in Ontario. It's the only native apple in Ontario, and it's one of two native species in Canada. It grows in like a shrub or a small tree. It has pale pink flowers that appear in early or late May and early June. And the fruit are small and green and eventually turning a slight yellow tone when they're ripe. Wildlife love to eat the fruit. It's not clear about humans, although when they do, it's usually for cider or applesauce. And I would be particularly interested to learn more about the role of this native apple in indigenous communities over the many years in the past. Something that we don't know very much about. Incidentally, I should mention that sweet crabapple doesn't really get its name from the taste of the fruit. It actually refers to the scent of the flowers. Anyway, the species is restricted to the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley, and it's relatively uncommon in Ontario. It doesn't normally grow farther north than a line that one could draw from London to Cambridge to Hamilton. And even within those southern areas of the country can be very hard to find. It typically grows in forest edges, and it grows in open, semi-open areas. A great place to see them is at Rare, particularly on the trails near the George Street parking lot and on the Grand Trunk Trail. And that's one of the reasons why we were attracted to working at Rare. In fact, I think the largest population that I'm aware of is at Rare, anywhere in Southern Ontario. So the second species is the one that we've just been eating, the domestic apple, and it's known scientifically as Malus domestica. It's somewhat closely related to the sweet crabapple, and I think everybody here has a pretty good image of this tree. It's a medium to large size. It tends to produce flowers that look a lot like the sweet crabapple, only they tend to be white, maybe with a bit of pink streaking. And of course, the fruit are relatively large compared to the sweet crabapple, and they're highly variable in their shape and their size, and of course in their flavor. And that's part of what interests many of us. A little bit of the history. This tree originated in Central Asia. In fact, the progenitor of the domestic apple still can be found growing there. And it was introduced from Europe in the 1600s when settlers first brought seeds and even some of their favorite cultivars to North America. And today, of course, the commercial apple growing industry is a $600 million industry that's thriving as well in Ontario, but in other locations throughout North America. So there are all sorts of different varieties or cultivars, sometimes we'll use that word, thousands of them that are grown worldwide. Over 200 have been grown commercially in Ontario. And currently there are probably 15 to 20 that are grown on a large scale in our province. So there's been a sort of over time, a narrowing of the diversity of cultivars that are actually being used. What you might not realize is that the cultivars are mass produced through cloning and grafting, which Diane referred to. So a particular variety has the same genetic type regardless of where it's grown in North America or around the world. So for example, a Macintosh tree anywhere in the world is a clone. It's a direct descendant of the original Macintosh tree that was grown in Dundela, Ontario. One other thing I guess worth pointing out is that domestic apple are also able to grow outside of cultivation. So they can escape the orchards or home orchards that people might grow them in and become established in the wild, wherever seeds might have been deposited by people or by wildlife. And these trees just seem to grow happily and produce large amounts of fruit and perpetuate the population over time because they're successful at reproducing. You see them in forest edges, in hedgerows, and a lot of different open areas in southern and central Ontario. In other words, you see them in sweet crabapple habitat. So at Rare, again, it's a great example of where sweet crabapple grows in close proximity to feral domestic apples, that is the domestic apples that have escaped cultivation. And that interaction is something that we've been particularly interested in. So that just sets the stage maybe for Paul to talk a little bit about our research on sweet crabapples.
Okay, so as Brian mentioned, there are a lot of crab apples and a lot of feral domestic apples at Rare, so it's been a perfect place to research the interaction between these species. I should point out that the things we learn about these two species can be applied to bigger questions about the natural world. And we try to put things in these larger contexts. So for example, how do introduced species affect native species? And we've heard about ways that introduced species can negatively impact the native species, but there can be positive effects too. For example, if they provide resources for native pollinator species. When we ask the question, where are feral trees coming from and how do they differ from cultivated ones, that can add to our knowledge of just in general, how do invasions of plant species occur? And finally, we can ask, what does the current distribution of species and genetic types tell us about the past? Are these feral trees a little window into past land use patterns and plant cultivation in Ontario? So I'm going to talk about some things we've learned from the sweet crabapple. So the first thing we learned is that behind this deceptively simple, elegant exterior, there's a bewildering array of things going on reproductively, so that these crab apples produce multiple types of seeds, and and these seeds vary in different ways. And one of the ways they differ is in having different numbers of chromosomes. Now, you don't have to worry about the details of that too much, but it'll be helpful if you know that most crabapple trees, sweet crabapples, have 4 sets of chromosomes. So the first type of seed they produce are sexually produced seeds where they have the same number of chromosomes as the parents. There's a contribution from a male and a female direction. And so they're a genetic mix of the 2 parents. So this is basically sex, like you learned about in school. However, sometimes they produce seeds that have extra sets of chromosomes. So sometimes you'll get seeds that have 6 sets of chromosomes or 8 sets of chromosomes. Also, all this sex we've talked about so far is going on between crabapple trees, but sometimes the male contributing to the seed is domestic apple, in which case you get a hybrid seed that's a mix of domestic apple and crabapple. And because the domestic apples have a different number of chromosomes for slightly complicated reasons, we get 3 types of hybrid seeds that have either 3, 4, or 5 sets of chromosomes. And then finally, in case you thought there was nowhere else to go, sometimes they produce seeds asexually. And there's 2 types of these, some that have 4 sets of chromosomes, just like mom. And those ones are actually genetically identical to the mother. They're essentially clones of the mother. And then sometimes you get asexual seeds with only half the number of chromosomes. So the main message here is these crabapples can potentially produce several different types of offspring. And some of those are hybrids with domestic apple. So that's the first thing we found. And then the next thing we found was that in any given year, 25 to 28% of the crabapple seeds produced at Rare are actually hybrids with domestic apple. So this is what the yellow arrow is meant to indicate, the movement of pollen back and forth between the large domestic apple on the right and the small crabapple on the left. This picture was actually taken at Rare on the Alvar. So that's a big chunk of the crabapple seeds that are actually hybrids. So it makes sense to think that the domestic apples must be impacting crabapple reproduction. But another thing we found was that although we've got all these hybrid seeds, when we look at the adult trees, and we looked at over 100 of them, we only found 1 adult tree that was a hybrid. So with some of these results in mind, the wide variety of seed types, the high rate of hybridization in seeds, but the relatively low rate of hybrids in adults, we came up with a couple of research questions which we've been exploring at Rare. Now the first one, which is actually the most recent one, is just looking at the numbers and types of seeds that are produced by the crabapples and how that shifts around when domestic apple pollen is present versus when it's excluded from the flowers. And this project's been taken on by Elena Greaves, who's doing a master's project in our lab. And Elena has a short video clip about this project, which is part of this virtual arts and science community showcase that we're participating in right now. So you should be able to find that online in the next couple of days if you want to know more about Elena's project. The other project, which has occupied us for 14 years now at Rare, is a transplant study. So what we did was we took the 5 most common seedling types, including 2 of the types of hybrids. We planted a whole bunch of them out at Rare in a couple different locations, some out by the Alvar and some in what has become known as Crabapple Field, sort of between George Street and the Grand Trunk Trail. And what we're doing is just monitoring how the different types survive and trying to figure out where all those hybrid seedlings are going, why they're not surviving until adulthood, or what's going on there. So hopefully we'll have some results on that front in the next year or so that we can publish. Okay. And yeah, so now I think Brian will move on to talk a bit more about some more feral apple, domestic apple focused stuff.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I mean, because of the discovery of a large amount of hybridization from domestic apple, that's really stimulated us to explore this more fully, especially on the domestic apple side, not just on the sweet crabapple side, because the implications of that hybridization can be quite significant, both from an ecological point of view, but also in terms of agricultural sustainability. So because of that, we started to explore the domestic apple side a bit more, and we spent quite a bit of time studying them using genetic fingerprinting and paternity analyses, something you might not think of being used in plants. And some of this work was done by a graduate student, Dane Kron, which we're particularly proud of. Anyway, this work has allowed us to think more precisely about who the domestic fathers are in the hybridization process, and that's an important step in terms of deciding or learning what their implications are, but also the management of feral apples, for example, and trying to find ways to minimize the impacts of hybridization. So there are a couple of things that have emerged from this genetic work that I just wanted to touch on. The first is that we find the hybrid seeds on sweet crabapples don't appear to be from domestic cultivars, that is, those trees grown in orchards or backyard trees. Rather, the hybrid pollen is coming from feral domestic trees that are growing nearby, as this image shows here. And you can see at rare, the domestic feral trees are actually growing in very close proximity to the crabapples. So another example of this is in the next slide, which basically is just an aerial shot of part of rare. And you can see that purpley pink dot, that's the location of a sweet crabapple. And the green enhanced colored areas are various feral domestic apples at rare, all in close proximity to the sweet crabapple. And what we've done is we've identified 2 different hybrid seeds produced by the crabapple, and then used a kind of paternity analysis to figure out who the most likely fathers were. And it turns out the most likely fathers are not lined up with the cultivars that we know genetically, but in fact, we can trace back to individual feral trees in this open alvar, as you can see labeled 1 and 2 here. So the paternity analysis is starting to give us a sense of how the pollen is being moved and what kinds of domestic trees are playing an important role in generating the hybrids. We've also used genetic analyses to learn more about the feral apples themselves. That is, where they come from, how do they originate, from what cultivars are they coming? And so far, we've learned a few interesting things here. And I thought I'd just show you this very colorful diagram to try to help relay a couple of important findings. The first is that the feral trees, when we look at them genetically, are not recognizable cultivars, right? So genetically, they just don't match up to the cultivars that are widely grown or have been widely grown in Ontario. Rather, they are mixtures of known cultivars. So what's happened is the cultivars growing in cultivation have mated with each other, and the seeds somehow have gotten out, and they now represent combinations of known cultivars. So it's sort of a melting pot of apples. And this is probably not surprising because domestic apples only produce seeds when they're pollinated by a different cultivar, which means that their seeds will always be combinations of more than one cultivar. Now, when we start to sample feral trees on a really large scale, and look at them genetically, we see diagrams like the one that's shown here, which shows basically that the feral trees are not even uniform. They actually consist of 2 genetically quite distinct groups. And you can see that in this kind of a evolutionary tree that's shown here, where each line represents a separate feral tree. And the closer the lines are to one another, the more similar they are genetically. You can see we've used colors to show you there's 2 really major groupings, the blue grouping and the red. And those 2 groups are most similar to different groups of cultivars. So it's kind of interesting to note that the blue group actually has a large number of cultivars that are very similar to these, but not exactly the same. And that includes many of the varieties or cultivars that have been used in the breeding of apples in the 20th century, varieties that we would be very familiar with. The red group, on the other hand, has a alliance with different kinds of cultivars, including, interestingly, a group of Russian cultivars of Russian origin, things like Alexander, Antonovka, Loeb's Queen, Yellow Transparent, a number of different cultivars that show strong associations with those feral apples. So it seems like different cultivars are giving rise to feral apples, and to different degrees. Yeah, and I think we took this one step further and we asked, so for individual trees, who are the most likely parent cultivars? Can we learn something from that in the Southern Ontario context? And when we do that, we actually find something interesting. That is that a number of cultivars are giving rise to these feral trees, but it was 9 specific cultivars that kept showing up time and time again as the most likely parents of many of those feral trees. And this is a list of those 9 top contributors to feral trees. And you'll notice that all of them are heritage varieties. That is, they were developed prior to 1906. Some of them might actually look familiar because they're still being grown today. Northern Spy, Macintosh, in particular, Red Delicious, so for example, and then others are actually very difficult to find at all, still being grown in the province. So it's an interesting story in that we're seeing many of the feral apples today that are hybridizing with the native apple, retaining this genetic legacy of our early apple growing days in Ontario. I think with that, I'll turn back to Paul.
Okay, so because we developed the genetic database for the projects Brian was just talking about, we decided this year to launch a project where we'd like to get more public involvement in our work and sort of start giving back a bit by offering some of our resources to the public. So we started something called the Ontario Heritage and Feral Apple Project. And we have 3 goals, at least at the moment. The first is to make our cultivar identification tests available to the public. So for a very modest fee that doesn't really cover our expenses, but helps out, we'll identify cultivars for you. If you have an old tree and send us a leaf, we can test it for you. We're also working on expanding our genetic database of heritage cultivars, adding a few more unusual varieties to that data. And we're reaching out to people who have old trees to help us with that too. And then finally, we're just generally trying to improve our knowledge about the distribution of abandoned orchards, historic trees, and native crab apples in Ontario. And there's places on our website where you can contribute information about those things. And I just want to give you a few examples of where this is going. This was actually a couple of years ago, but somebody sent us a sample for a tree by their old farmhouse near Lake Scugog, and we were able to identify it as a Wolf River, which is shown in this 1896 catalog as the giant show apple. These apples are so big that it's said that you can make a pie from 1 apple. So that was kind of fun finding that. Our friend Christina out in New Brunswick, who I suspect is listening right now, sent us a sample from her farm, and we were able to confirm her suspicion that it was a Famuse, or also known as snow. This is an old Canadian variety that was probably brought to as a seed from France in the 18th century, or possibly even the 17th century, and has been claimed to be the most likely parent of Macintosh, although we don't think that's true. Some upcoming work, there's a historic house in Hamilton called Balfour or Shadok House. They have a beautiful old orchard that's probably at least 100 years old, and we're going to be helping them to identify some of their trees this year. And yes, I did take a bite out of that crab apple before I took the picture, just in case you're wondering. And finally, I want to mention there's a very active group up on St. Joseph's Island near Sault Ste. Marie called the Algoma Lost Apple Project. And they've sent us about 70 samples from old orchard trees. We're going to try to match some of those up to this old ledger from the area from 1916 that lists some trees that were sold at that time to farmers in the area, and includes some unusual varieties. So we're really looking forward to that too. So just going to finish up by saying that our research on apples has taken us in a lot of different directions, and we feel like we're always learning and we're always hoping to learn more. There's lots to learn about how apples interact with apples, but also it's great always finding out new ways that apples and people are interacting, you know, whether we think of them as sources of nourishment or sources of economic return or sources of joy, or even windows into our past. And of course, apples are always sources of inspiration. And I just want to quickly thank Rare for the research opportunities for this week's event and for everything. Thanks. Okay.
Over to Karen now.
Good. Hi, everybody. So let me just start by saying it would be sort of nice if you could dig out the pips from your apples that you ate and have them nearby. They're going to show up in one of my poems. So I think they're kind of extraordinary, the little apple seeds, the little pips. So I'll start by answering a question that was put to me that says, how did Paul and Brian's work influence mine? Or another way of putting that is, how did their words and their insights find their way into my poems? So I'll say a little bit about that. So in 2014, I was the inaugural artist in residence, also known as the Eastern Writer in Residence, at North House. And North House is on Blair Road, and it's part of the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. And I lived there in North House for 3 months, from September to November in 2014. So I arrived as the writer in residence with, I didn't have a manuscript underway. I arrived with a kind of blank slate. And I actually had 2 intentions. And one intention was to try to really inhabit authentically the place where I was. And when I mean that inhabit authentically, I meant like, I knew I had to be sensitive, like polysensitive to the political histories of that space, the geological truths of that place, the archaeological histories of that space, the forest truths of that space. So not just one aspect of where I was, but to inhabit it authentically felt to me like I had to minimally be polysensitive to all of those different aspects of what that place is. And the second intention that I had was, I really did want to try to write poetry of that place. And that meant at that particular time, that time in history, in that season, which was fall, and at the particular moment we are in history. So those were the challenges and the intentions that I set myself. But then the question becomes like, how does one actually do that? How does one get to know or have like sort of portals into any of those different histories? How do you hear those histories, those truths? How do you attune your eyes to be able to see those? Is it a question of watching? Is it a question of listening? Is it a question of research? So that was at the outset of the residency. And so one decision, I want to say one decision out of many, many, many decisions I made. But one decision that I made was to read scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals that had been written by scientists who did their research at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. And Brian and Paul's research was among those. So it wasn't the only one, but their research really is a kind of commitment to, I mean, they've been going there for more than 17 years to pay attention to one particular part of that complex whole. And it's interesting because prior to having read their work, I would sort of daily set out on my quest to get familiar with the place, and I would walk the land. I have good eyes. I have the eyes of a person who was raised in the bush, and I would go down to the river, and I would walk up past the alvars. I would come up through what's called Crabapple Meadow. I would walk the Grand Trunk Trail and cross Crookston's Creek and then come back to North House. So I did that every day. But what was really, really interesting to me was that after reading the scientific articles that had been created or done or worked from that very place, then it's like sort of when you're at the optometrist and then you can't see anything, but then they click a few clicks. And then the walks that I had done previous to that, coming up through those spaces again, there were things that I was seeing that I would not have seen before had it not been for basically borrowing the eyes and the insights of the scientists who'd done their research there. So there was many other layers to this book. There's many other forms of knowing besides the scientific procedures that we know. There's many other kinds of sciences. There's different kinds of sensitivities other than just a kind of data-based empiricist sensitivity. I wanted to not have the book that was just driven by a Western empirical science, but I also knew that there's ways in which that methodology just really drills down into where we are and shows us things that we wouldn't otherwise see. There's other different kinds of writing. There's archaeological records. There's the writings that are the tracks of animals that live there. There's many different kinds. There's tourist brochures. There's maps. And the point was that in order to really inhabit authentically that place, what I tried to do was to give myself over to like the most maximally pluralistic way of being in that space that I could. So if anybody's interested in hearing more, reading more about that epistemic frame that I used or the methodology that I used, there are a number of articles that I've published about that. So feel free to get in touch with me if that interests you and you want to hear more. Okay, so moving slightly into the themes that ended up sort of emerging as a result of working on this book. One of the things that I love about literature that is a license available in literature that's not available when you're writing scientific articles is that the themes that I settled upon they try to mirror the kinds of commitment to pluralistic ways of seeing and the form that I wrote these poems. So the themes and the forms fit together. And one of the themes, there's many themes that emerge in this book, The Grand River Watershed. But one of the themes that emerges from having paid attention and inhabiting that space on my terms and on the terms of other people's and distance people is that the material physical realities that we are in which we inhabit, they don't just move in one direction. And they certainly don't move just at one pace. So when you translate that, what that means is that genes, proteins, peoples, wind, waters, toxins, crickets, that these are various histories and they're not necessarily all just sort of marching on toward a future. There's very interesting ways in which temporalities and physicalities and spatialities are moving forward, backwards, sideways, and in circles all at the same time. So a hypothesis that emerges from that I think is a really important hypothesis for all of us, but maybe especially for artists, is that meaning making also doesn't move in one direction, that efforts to make meaning also happens at the same time that meanings are unmade and leaving space for other meanings, maybe old meanings that haven't had spaces or new meanings that we haven't even thought yet. So you might think, well, what does this matter? What are the implications of this? But the implications for the work that I love the most are very concrete. So think about what we've just been hearing about apples and old apples and indigenous orchards, and we use the word lost. And when I say the word lost, like my heart just absolutely sinks. because to say something is lost means never to return again. But if we have a framework, like with our spirit and our hearts and our minds and our sciences, that leave space for the possibility that what is lost is not lost once and for all, that it can be recycled, regenerated, maybe mutated, maybe hybridized, but that the lost isn't just maybe entirely lost. And for me, that contains the most sort of intense vector of hope that that I could possibly imagine. So that's to say something about the themes. Now I'm going to read not all of, but some of the poem that sits at the spine of the book, literally the poem, which is called When North Flows South. It sits on its own watershed, so half of it is facing toward the back of the book and half of it is facing toward the front. So I'm going to read sections from When North Flows South. And I want to alert the readers to a few names or terms that you'll encounter. So you're going to hear the name Dodges, Langdons, Kilbrides, and Crookston's. These are some of the names of the families of the United Empire Loyalists who moved up into Canadian territories, which were not then at that point Canadian territories, after the war between the British and the United States. You're going to hear the name Nat Dodge or Nathaniel Dodge. Nathaniel Dodge was a settler in that region on the Blair Flats, and his cabin is no longer there, but what's really beautiful is that there are a number of very, very old trees around where his cabin was that attest to the fact that that was the site of the first settlement by a white person moving north into that area. The name Augustus Jones shows up. For those of us who live in Guelph, we might know the name Jones Baseline, but not necessarily associate it with the formal name Augustus Jones. Augustus Jones was a surveyor for the Canadian Company, and he worked alongside John Galt in laying out the grid that becomes the grid imposed upon this region of southwestern Ontario. And he was a friend and confederate of Joseph Brant, after whom Brantford is named. But the original Mohawk name of Joseph Brant is Tiandanagea. And I guess there's one other little thing I wanted you to know is that the name Alton shows up, and Alton is a tiny town up way in the north of the watershed of the Grand. All right. And so I'll read some sections from When North Flows South. There's an epigram from Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher, who says, "It pertains to the essence of becoming to move and to pull in both directions at once." The pink lace of the wild crabapple froths up out of the Carolinian cleavage in late May or early June. 200 years ago, the Pennsylvania Dutch arrived in wooden wagons, and they took up on the northern edge of the natural range of the wild apple, Malus coronaria. The Scots came by boat 2 decades later, followed on foot by those loyal to the crown, the Dodges, the Langdons, the Kilbrides, the Crookstons. They took up on all the rest. Our evidence suggests that the spatial structuring of community diversity developed rapidly in the first year. Membership was facilitated and constrained within the first few months of formation, including stochastic processes at the initial stages of assembly. I-beams and Holsteins, fire, forge, soot, black iron awls, stables, and dung and stone stack walls. These and their people formed an unbroken chain the length of the river from Erie to its source on either side. It appears on many early maps as the Ouse. Augustus Jones himself surveyed it by mistake as the Ouse, as the Conestoga west of Eramosa. Now it's the south branch of the Speed. The Speed entering the Grand like an infinite otter, absorbed into faster water and it gushes southward as if it was only ever one. 50 feet across and with a stony bottom, perpetually sluicing off the limestone viaduct. A married stream entering the main. She runs hard and straight as a plumb line from here. 43 degrees north, 80 degrees west. Hypothesis. On the off chance, the off-leash trails ahead, in October, there, the dog lopes. I crunch a Macintosh or an Empress, browning the core pitched, thoughtless, a dog zigzagging, a red-backed vole, under leaf skirts, there's a rustle, a wolf head emerges from the dappling shade. The pre-European plant cover of this site is undocumented, but the presence of centuries-old bur oaks suggests an open and possibly grass-dominated system. Stump burned, perfect, 5 by 5 Punnett squares of prairie, spade bared the shoulder of the Carolinian slopes. And then they planted apples. Hound and I pass a solitary bur oak on the Blair Road at the fork of the Aramosa and the Grand. The bur oak, it's a little bit alive, the outermost photosynthesizing. Circles, the dog sniffs, the old bones, Nat Dodge's cabin. It's not much either. Literature review. Nicked pips, moldering endospermic cargo across the ribs of the North Atlantic, through the rut named Ohio, in a handkerchief. Here come the puny chestnut-colored promises from the old world, spit-pocketed. If they ever get there, they might eat something that tastes like home. Prune and graft, splice and sucker, knock-kneed, ladder it up and over the split rail crutches, jam it in the armpits of the drooping limbs, emasculated, flowering at the balloon stage, thrips, thrum, twine. The stack boxes of burrowed bees are circling the flush-faced orchard, pinked the very moment June lets her heat leak out, blossom. An apple is a plain fruit occurring in many parts of the world as an introduced exotic. Footnote, Paul Kron and Brian C. Husband, quote, hybridization and the reproductive pathways mediating gene flows between native Malus coronaria and domestic apple, Malus domestica. In Botany 87-9, 2009, pages 864 to 74. An apple is a plain fruit occurring in many parts of the world as an introduced exotic. Tit round, a fleshy haploid, a peckful, a handful of hips, pinched at the waist, every flesh imaginable, every skin tone, every shape on the lips, different again at the tongue, its universes of fruit muscle, red, green, yellow, speckled, russet, white, white on white, rosy pink, dog piss yellow, hard, soft, wet, pucker. Novel phenotypic traits were developed through a variety of breeding technologies. To date, 57 applications for field trials of genetically modified apples have been submitted to the USDA. Catch and release. Apples form a subtribe drifted from the rich and powerful family Rosaceae, which includes important food crops such as plums, raspberries, peaches, strawberries, and commonly grown ornamentals, example, rosa. Roses come in wild, and roses come in common too. Though populations of immigrant species tended to fluctuate more considerably from year to year. Each population was grown in soil collected from each site that had either been sterilized or not to synchronize germination and ensure from each line at least 12 viable seeds. at Thanksgiving. Here we are at table together. The hard harvest is in. The black and white photo confirms what appeared to be a family, Augustus Jones and Joseph Brandt. A relationship strengthened when Jones married a Mohawk woman with whom he had 8 children. In one trial, DNA content proved intertwining branches. In some cases, was very worrisome to those who could recall the days when the North flowed south. Concurrently, Jones had a relationship with a Mississauga Indian woman that produced 2 more children. Across a fertility gradient, the rose, the dog rose, the apple-cheeked, loyal-footed children's children, roots sampled for colonization assessment bodies that grew flesh, every adaptation, every note, every tone, every red, green, yellow, speckled, russet, white, white on white, rosy pink, dog piss yellow, every black, every white, every brown, every schimmelfeld chestnut hair, all tones upward of pure. Confirmation hypothesis. An apple and a rose are posing for a still life, lying side by side, awkward in the absolute metabolic gulag of controlled laboratory conditions. Malus coronaria and Malus domestica intermixed within the site, risking extensive interspecific flowering overlap, despite previous reports showing that the native and introduced gene pools remain distinct. The high proportion of hybrid seeds suggests there's significant potential for gene flow from domestic apples into native coronaria populations. The hard rain and the buckthorn. The hard rain and the buckthorn bully the mail-order children into grain and empire, sweet-talking rose thugs to houseware. First generation F1 hybrids exhibit almost zero viability. Conclusion. In the overall enterprise of fitness, we are husbandry and burning and forcing and selective reduction and slaughter and outcrossing and end of season barn dance. And 200,000 years of tinkering and fish too far south of where they were. In the practices of population management, we are the distance we leave between things, and we are the direction we make them flow. The tall grass prairie and the oak savannas that covered an estimated 100,000 hectares of southwestern Ontario at the time of European settlement, today less than 1% remains. The forward edge of the range of natural history, it was delivered in foil packets to the northernmost rim of the California forest. In Waterloo region, it crested like a tidal bore and pivoted south. It was as if somebody had grabbed nature like a hall carpet and shook hard, and the rain climbed the clouds and the Grand River walked barefoot to a burbling spring west of Alton and was received as both prodigal and stranger. The oak-shaped shade of this old bur oak, it knows the exact moment Nathaniel Dodge stopped pushing north and he began to farm. Drab clay and sandy loams are preponderating. Dairy cows, laying hens, commercial meats, rabbits, broilers, stewing hens, some evidence of equine industry. The barn paint flakes off into Crookston Creek. The farm dog sniffs the ice house slit and whines. Coyotes get bolder. Like all things with stomachs, their home range dilates with hunger. 50 feet closer each morning. The kitchen door the white-tailed deer. They have come to lick the fructose off our abandoned orchards.
Thank you so much, Karen and everyone. We're running a little bit short on time, so I just wanted to pause here for a second and say thank you to everyone for attending, and just again reiterate my thanks to the Cambridge North Dumfries Community Foundation and also Silver Creek Nursery for getting us all of these apples today. We're going to go a little bit over time and have another 10 or 15 minutes here together with the panelists so we can do some Q&A. But if you have to leave us, we understand. You can watch this video again after. We're going to be posting it to our YouTube channel. So stick around for the next 15 minutes if you can. We'll do some questions. And if not, hopefully you can catch the video after.
Thanks so much, Jenna. And thanks again to Diane and Paul and Brian and Karen for sharing your work with us. We'll have some time, a little bit of time for conversation now, and maybe a couple of audience questions. In the way that we begin our events with an acknowledgement of the land and the Indigenous nations we inhabit it with, I wanted to start the discussion by asking the question of whether the panelists can speak a little bit more to the way in which the story of the apples is bound up with the story of settler colonialism. So you can turn on your cameras and let's just be together for the discussion period all together. I think you can just leave your cameras on. So this is an open question for anyone that wants to respond. Karen, I think this is something that you discussed a little bit in your poetry, and Diane, you had also referred to Indigenous orchards that had been wiped out. I just think it's important that we start our discussion in this way, and then we can move into, I have one question for each of you, considering the time that we have.
I guess I would this might not be exactly what you're asking, but I am kind of curious about what Diane was saying about the Indigenous orchards, because and I see somebody in the audience ask this question too. There seem to be two possibilities there. One, that the Indigenous people were actually had orchards of crab apples, which is a possibility. And I've been sort of curious about whether that might explain some of the kind of odd genetic patterns we see in different crabapple populations, that if some of those areas were actually planted or propagated in some way, that might explain some of what we're seeing. But the other possibility is that these Indigenous orchards were actually like post-colonial, that so they were actually the domestic apples that were being developed by Indigenous people at some point. But I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, I wish I had more specific dates and times and history and geography. I learned it from reading Helen Humphrey's book, Ghost Orchard, and she goes in greater detail on orchards across North America that I imagine may have predated and also been synchronous with settler orchards, except they were, she has accounts terrible stories of orchards being burned and trees being girdled so they all die, and of course this valuable food producing landscape being stolen from Indigenous people. And the result of that is that I don't know about contemporary research on this now, but that there were apples that were propagated and grafted by Indigenous peoples, and varietals that were named, and many of the names were changed and, you know, appropriated by settlers. And so there are all kinds of puzzles, and people are researching, you know, tracing back to orchards, varietals, apple varietals developed by Indigenous people. But I don't know any more detail about it than that. But if anyone's curious about that history, it's a lovely, you know, literary reflection on it, the Helen Humphreys book.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of richness to be found in researching those topics, because we feel like apples came with settlers. You know, when you think about Johnny Appleseed, worthwhile to think about which ways those things have changed. I don't know if Karen, you want to say anything before we move on to the next question?
Well, just briefly, I mean, one of the powerful forces that literature and the imaginary can do is to sort of break off chunks of old beliefs that might have been put into our thinking patterns by, you know, when we were in elementary school, et cetera. And a lot of us actually were received the tales that agriculture began with the Europeans, that, you know, that it's true that sort of the best things that arrived in North America came with the Europeans. And so even just putting like the smallest seed into sort of disruption of that, that says there's different forms of agricultures, and there were many, many forms of food making and food procuring that would have had to have been practiced before colonization, before contact. And even that itself, I think, is not nothing to say, that just to allow the imaginaries of young peoples and old peoples that didn't even have this possibility of thinking, is that apples, potatoes, corn, fungi themselves might have had a sort of working relationship with peoples before Europeans, which fed the land and fed the peoples. And maybe we're not always like sunny and great, maybe we're not, you know, always like didn't work out, but that those ways of being in the land were alive prior to the Europeans' arrival in Turtle Island. So I think that itself is like an enormous sort of shift or a challenge to a pretty settled narrative.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks for making space in this conversation for that question. I want to ask each panelist a question. I'm going to start with Diane, just in case your son comes crashing through the door. So I've known about your work for a long time, and so it's a real pleasure to be sitting here virtually with you. And your work is so relational. I think I heard you mention it in an interview as a jam of knowledge or an exchange, which is what's going on here. What was the turning point in your work where you started incorporating nature or the non-human? So I'm thinking of your mushroom forays in Cape Breton, or bees, beehives, moving weeds, in addition to humans as part of that relationship, or was working with the natural world something that was always there in your art?
Oh, wow, thanks. There's so many questions in there. I have to say, I'm just so grateful to Karen for articulating some of these things so beautifully, you know, just this kind of curiosity and this commitment. How did you say it, Karen? I was writing it down: to inhabit a place authentically, polysensitive, a maximally pluralist frame, you know. I think, again, I'm lucky to be an artist and not a scientist, and not, you know, and free to use a lot of tools and to follow my curiosity only as long as I care to, and follow, you know, things that delight me, and that, you know, I just, you know, want to have new experiences and feel some intimate, like bodily, multi-sensory knowledge and closeness to things. And so I guess I've just been sort of predisposed to following these curiosities. Like, I grew up actually in Mississauga, in the suburbs, not particularly close to nature. And I think being an artist has given me a kind of, you know, space and time to follow these things with a kind of devotion and closeness. And, you know, I'm also just really interested in learning new things. And so I love to meet people who know much more than I do about all these subjects. And you know, being in the field and learning things hands-on and having experiences, you know, using my senses and making relationships and being together with others has also been very, very important to my practice. And instead of like making things where I'm the expert, I love to make things where I hang out with experts and can learn things and model ways of learning things and just practice ways of being intensely engaged in the world. And it's kind of ironic right now. I feel like I can't make anything I usually make because all of those things are, yeah, a problem at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like it's a new understanding of art for a lot of people to understand, like a community orchard as art, not just a sculpture, but of the engagements between humans or the engagement between humans and non-humans as an act of art.
Yeah. I realize it's kind of mischievous in a few ways. You know, I didn't talk too much about my hopes for the orchard and, you know, intentions that it might be, you know, cared for and people might participate in the, you know, future of the orchard as a community orchard, and people might learn about fruit tree growing. They might have picnics under the blossoms. They might read poems or do performances there. They might, I mean, I don't even know what's possible, but I see it as, you know, if I think about what public art is and what I wish public art could be, you know, I liked the idea of making something beautiful. It's not that practical as a community orchard. It's actually very fussy and complicated. It's really something about, it's about beauty and, you know, uncommon tastes, stories. And, you know, that was really exciting for me to have like a bit of public space, you know, framed out forever for this beautiful, unusual thing. And, you know, whether people identify it as art, I don't think they need to. You know, they could still enjoy trees and eat apples, and, you know, that matters more for me.
Thanks so much, Diane. I wanted to ask a question of Karen. How do you see, is your writing changing in the way that you engage with nature or the non-human? Has it changed since your first collection of poetry, or was being at North House something that changed it, or is it something that was there all along for you?
It's a tough question. So the first book of poetry that I published, Ballast, which was, I think, around 2000, it had a problematic, and the particular problematic of that book was how does one like fully commit to being to loving another human being when one knows that one's immortal, but that one's time on the earth is actually physically limited. So that was actually the proposition of that book, and there was not a lot of the non-human that showed up in that because it wasn't part of the problematic. Although the cosmos and temporality plays a big role in that one. And then the second book had a different question. It was something like, what are the conditions and circumstances that allow us to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? And how do we stay hard and soft, and how do we not succumb to the most painful things that can happen to us as human beings, whether it's like a cheating wife, or your beloved that dies of cancer. So I mean, I was taking that very seriously, as what does it mean to be able to be durable and endure and have the ability to be resilient. So it was about resilience as a human being. And then the project at North House that the residency allowed me was, I just had a different question that came up, which probably was hand in hand with like my own philosophical work, which was moving more and more away from humanist ethics and humanist political theory to wonder about the possibility of having a post-humanist political theory, a post-humanist ethical framework, which is, I don't want to say it's the same as an Indigenous worldview. That's sort of a bit grotesque, but it has some of the resonances of Indigenous worldviews. For instance, that seeds are our brothers and sisters, and they have particular destinies. Those destinies can be blocked by our carelessness or inaction, and we have responsibilities that extend beyond just the parameters of the human world. So I think as a philosopher, those are the questions that I had been sort of arguing and thinking through and researching. And then plunk, I find myself as a poet. And so when I was writing those poems, I wasn't thinking, you know, as a human with a particularly human problem that I wanted to work out poetically. It was really the case of, how is it even possible for us to honor and be grateful to the many, many different histories that are flowing in all directions that we are a part of, without being like, without producing something has no sense, or that's too chaotic, or that doesn't give any kind of pathways or direction to anything or anybody. So I just had a different problematic there that probably was thanks to being able to be like literally plunked down in an incredible geographical space that was really awe-inspiring. So
thank you, Karen.
thanks, Anna.
When I hear Karen talking about loss and resilience and responsibility, I think that's a good tie-in to my question for Brian and Paul, which is what do we risk losing by allowing heritage cultivars to disappear altogether? Or what's the value in keeping all these cultivars alive? You know, when I have these things here from the apple tasting, I'm like, I have to keep these seeds, you know, it's important. And you know, why are they being sidelined, and what is so important about keeping them going, and our responsibility to that? And that'll be our last question.
Good.
Oh boy. Well, Paul, feel free to jump in, but I think there are a lot of layers to that, Anna. I mean, there are many things that are changing. Society's desires and for flavors and shapes and sizes evolves. The mechanisms by which we seek or create those is evolving. So in other words, the technologies for generating new varieties and new cultivars is on the move, and it's becoming faster and becoming more I guess targeted than it ever has before. And specifically, we're targeting the traits that the current society seems to desire, and that can be a positive and a negative. The positive is that we're working with variety that may be of real desire in the current age, but the negative is that we may be forgetting the value of the varieties and the variation that we had in the first place. So I think in general, not just in apples, but many other food crops, we're seeing a narrowing of the genetic base upon which our crops are based. And while that's getting us perhaps to certain characteristics that we seem to want badly, in the longer term, we forget that we're perhaps losing some opportunities and that we can't anticipate right now. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I would say the heritage varieties to me it has a practical value, but it also has an intangible historical value, and both of those are important. The practical one is preserving some of that diversity, some of those flavors, shapes, and sizes that we still cherish, that perhaps maybe we live vicariously through, by having them, because they represent a past that we either were part of or was even more distant than that. So I do think that there's something mystical about being connected to things from the past like that, and thinking about what they mean, especially because a lot of these varieties are direct descendants of the original trees. So there's something special about holding a Macintosh, knowing that the cell lineages from that apple came directly from the original tree. And then you start to read all the history, the hardships of the people who founded that land or settled that land. And all of a sudden, this simple apple takes on a whole bunch more meaning than just its taste and its flavor. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that there's that historical significance, and it'll be interesting to hear Paul's thoughts, but I think we both have been kind of excited about trying to imagine or recreate a time in the past based on what apples can tell us. But at the same time, there's that practical value of retaining the diversity, the variability it's a richness that we may value and need in the future, and we don't want to lose that.
Thanks. Paul?
I guess all I would add to that is it seems it's pretty clear that something would be lost, because when we talk to people, so many people are so excited about tracking down old cultivars and trying to make sure they're not lost. So it's clear that, people are feeling something there is being lost.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your time this evening and sharing your work and your thoughts with us. I think we do need to wrap up as the time has gone over, and I'll pass it on to Jenna, but thanks for inviting me to be part of this tonight. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just will say a quick goodbye. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists, Karen, Paul, Brian, Diane. Thanks so much for joining us. Anna, thank you for engaging us in this great conversation. I wish we had more time for more questions, because I know there's so much still that we could talk about, but again, maybe in the future in person would be great. And then just a final word of thanks, of course, to all of you at home who joined in with us this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Arts and Science Showcase today, tomorrow, and Thursday, and have a lovely evening. Good night, everyone.